Venezuelan Female Artists in the 20th Century, a presentation by Annette Mago. This presentation intends to rediscover and reconstruct a rich history of Venezuelan female artists that were especially active in the latter half of the 20th century, from the 1950s to the 1980s. Although there was an abundance of women participating in the Venezuelan art scene, especially as one of the most modernized Latin American countries at the time, a lot of this history is almost entirely obscured. And this could be for any number of reasons, because of recent events or just how the art history was recorded uh, over time. You'll note that along with a lot of native female Venezuelan artists, there are also many foreign-born artists that are participating in the Venezuelan art scene. This is because during that era, a lot of European exiles were coming into Venezuela and also participating as active artists that were very much a part of the artistic dialogue that was going on at the time. You'll find many female artists are active in all types of artistic fields, such as painting, sculpting, printmaking, ceramics, performance art, cinema, and so on. This presentation strives to reconstruct not only a very vibrant Venezuelan art history, but at the same time reconstructing a fragmented cultural identity. Going back to the last era of dictatorship between the 1940s and the 1950s, we see Marco Perez Jimenez, which is the last dictatorship of Venezuela, that was overthrown due to a political coup that was to unseat him in 1958. And during the Jimenez dictatorship, we actually see a lot of women's organizations that are mobilizing, that are going towards the cause of women's liberation, but towards the purpose of also liberating the public as a whole, and to the advantage of the many political organizations that are working in clandestine groups to contribute to the eventual overthrow of the Jimenez dictatorship. And these women's organizations, of course, as we see in over and over as a pattern in Latin American history, become very active during the dictatorship all the way up until the actual coup. And then once the installation of the democracy or the next government is initiated, we see those women's organizations start to basically fall back into the background. They no longer have like the same political relevance, and they no longer need that support coming from the women, because the political organizations tend to take over and ignore the initial promises that they made to these women's organizations. So this Venezuela is no exception to this pattern. The only notable difference is that this happened significantly earlier than was the general trend in Latin America. At the time of this, that the dictator was overthrown, 1958, this is already still like a couple decades even earlier than the general trend that this starts to happen within the Southern Cone of authoritarian regimes being overthrown in many different countries, and having a democratic and capitalistically friendly governments becoming installed. As the oil industry expands and industrialization takes hold in Venezuela, the middle class sector grows, and there's a huge influx of international influences coming into Venezuela, partly because a lot of Venezuelan children are now receiving their education from abroad. So many Venezuelan intellectuals are now becoming influenced by creatives and intellectuals from France, from England, from Italy, who are either being exiled and setting up their life in Venezuela, or whether it's returning native Venezuelans who come back having received and becoming exposed to all of these influences, specifically all of these art movements that are now going on in Europe. And they take all of those influences and they bring it back to Venezuela. And these are males and females as well, predominantly males, but also a significant number of females who are participating in the kind of culture movements that they see going on in Europe and recreating and modifying to the national landscape, basically uh, back home. Another artist experimenting with geometric abstraction is Gego. Gego is a German immigrant that came to live in Caracas, where she started experimenting with what she calls drawings without paper. So she never really described the works that she was creating as sculptures, more as she did as just forms that she was making that explain the interconnectivity of relationships of the universe without paper, basically drawings without paper. Diego is really recognized both in Venezuela and abroad as being really one of the more representative of the female artists that were working in this era in Venezuela. As her work develops in later years, we start to see a shift in technique and material usage. So she's employing a lot of what is a fairly new technique, a fairly new concept that is coming from France that is called assemblage. And that basically is taking everyday rubbish, everyday refuge that you see on the streets and basically thrown away propaganda, stuff like that, and including it into your art piece that and making it uh, something that brings interesting and new textures, meanings, uh, basically transforming the rubbish into a work of art. That's basically what the basis of assemblage is. And she's not really departing from geometric abstraction for a while, as we see at the top. She's still playing around with color and shapes and form, but she starts to move away from that. And then at the bottom left, you can see, for example, in the piece that has the big block letters objeto, she starts to really employ assemblage and develop her technique, and then we start to see at the rightmost, sorry, the rightmost artwork is one of her most famous, most commented on works of art that is called El Sol ha Descendido. And basically, it's a car headlight that she takes and she puts in the center of a very textured composition. And it's it completely changes the concept. Although she uses something, an everyday object, an object of virtually no value, she transforms it into something that is a much more complex concept out of that, just by simply placing it in a different context. Elsa Gramco's work is probably closest to what is the core philosophy of the informalist movement out of most of the female artists that we're going to see. Elisa Elvira Zuluaga, she was a painter primarily, well, at least in her early stages, and then she began to experiment with printmaking, and she was actually one of the pioneers in printmaking in Venezuela. So, we have documentation of her creating hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of prints to just select a few that she considered to be the perfect prints, the ones that got exactly the effect that she was looking for. So she was really dedicated to perfecting this craft. And a lot of her painstaking work goes unrecognized within her field, but it's definitely like there's record of it. She had a show, posthumous show, that displayed all of the prints, and not just the prints that she selected, but the extensive process that she engaged in order to end up with those prints. Marisol Escobar, or Marisol as she was known, where she resided in New York. She was a Venezuelan sculptor, although she most of her instruction was, well, at least half of her instruction was outside of Venezuela. She studied in the UK, and she came to live in New York. And in New York, she actually was a really big figure in the art scene at the time. Surprisingly enough, because the art scene in New York is much different from the one in that is going on in Venezuela at the time, which is much more European influenced. Although you do see some New York influences in there, because New York at this time is going through pop art, and the Warhol and Marisol, kind of went a completely different direction from what a lot of the artists were doing at that time. So she did a very kind of homemade, archaic type of traditionalist sort of look, with a very naturalistic forms. And she used a lot of the time her own body as her inspiration. A lot of the textiles and the art forms that she saw in her home in Caracas, she would put it into these large sculptures, these large lifelike sculptures that oftentimes had an ironic or a sarcastic kind of reflection towards society. And a lot of her artwork actually had a very feminist message, which again was something that was not generally accepted at the art movement at this time. In the same vein, Tecla Tofano was also another artist that definitely had a lot of feminist messages within her artwork, and she worked mainly with ceramics. And through her ceramic form, she would often do, again, very satirical, very ironic messages, and also ones that just had like a more of a wholesome feminist message. For example, the middle image we see, named El Género Femenino, and that one is very symbolic towards the liberation of the female gender, and uh, basically like embodying and uplifting the female form and the female spirit. Colette de Lausanne is one of many that are in that are part of the ceramics movement in Venezuela at this time. Miguel Arroyo, he had his own taller. He's a famous ceramicist at this time, and he has a taller with, you know, that includes actually many women, and they go on to be these masters basically in ceramics. So, and each one of them have a very unique style. Colette de Lausanne is no exception. She's a French-born ceramicist that moved to Venezuela and has been always very interested in naturalistic forms and and unique shapes. Ani Villanueva, she is Mary Brandt's daughter, and she also experiments with the performance art medium. But something that is, relatively new that is coming out at in the late 1980s, early 1990s, is a digital art form. So she starts to actually experiment in the same spirit, really, as the early geometric abstractionist that we see in the beginning of the informalist movement, and she's you know transferring it to a new medium. Lastly, I wanted to talk about my own inspirations. This is my own artwork that actually I don't really have titled yet, but it takes a lot of inspiration from this course, actually, Women in Latin America, and basically the struggles and the women's movements that we see throughout Latin America, throughout South America, and these are things that I personally felt shocked to have learned. Shocked for a number of reasons. One being that that this happened at all. The other being that I didn't know about it before. That I haven't learned about it in a South American or in just an American context in any way, shape, or form. And specifically coming from a female perspective. So I wanted to make a piece that was a testament basically to the indifference and the ignorance that that a lot of these women's struggles face, and how through solidarity and through knowledge and through collective movement and action we can slowly make progress.